the January 6th committee's public hearings may be on hiatus. But that hasn't stopped its members from sharing new details about their investigation. On Monday, Representative Elaine Luria released new video of unseen testimony from witnesses, including Ivanka Trump, talking about her father editing the script of a speech his staff had prepared. The former president refused to include language that he felt was too critical of the Capitol Hill rioters. President Biden condemned former President Trump's failure to act.
For 3 hours, the defeated former president of the United States watched it all happen. While he was doing that, brave law enforcement officers were subject to the medieval hell, face to face with crazed mob that believed the lies of a defeated president.
On Tuesday, former President Trump also made his first trip back to D.C. since leaving office. In a speech, he continued to spread lies about the 2020 election.
I always say I ran the first time and I won. Then I ran a second time and I did much better. We got millions and millions more votes. And you know what? That's going to be a story for a long time. What a disgrace it was.
In an interesting split-screen moment, his former vice president, Mike Pence, also spoke in Washington on the same day to a different group. Now, Pence, who we should remind people came close to being assaulted on January 6th, argued that the GOP needs to be focused on the future and not the past. So, Jonathan, I want to come to you. You, of course, have this book out. You talk about the big lie. Tell us a bit about sort of what you make of President Trump's speech continuing, former President Trump's speech, continuing to spread lies and the split screen that we just showed there.
Well, first of all, it's pretty good viral marketing for my book. So thank you, Mr. President, for that. No, it shows, though, that the big lie did not go away on January 6th. And in fact, Donald Trump is still fully embracing it. He refuses to look forward. He only wants to look backwards and relitigate 2020, much to the chagrin of many others in the Republican Party who do feel that they've got a pretty good political environment this fall. And they don't want to be talking about 2020. They frankly don't want to be talking about Donald Trump. But he refuses to let it go. And the lying just continues. And it's also shaping the Republican Party. So many Republicans have gone along with it. Even if they privately disagree, they don't dare publicly break with him with his erroneous claims of election fraud. We know it's a litmus test for a lot of the candidates that he supported this year, a number of whom won their primaries, but not all. The split screen with Pence was interesting because Pence represents that wing of Republicans who, of course, largely support most of what's Trump done, but won't go so far as to back him on what happened January 6th. Now, the January 6th committee hearings seem to have taken a bit of a toll on former President Trump's poll numbers. They've slipped slightly among Republicans, but only slightly. He is still by far the most powerful figure in the party. He was rapturously received in his speech in D.C. The other day. He is certainly the favorite to be the Republican nominee in 2024 were he to choose to run, and he's threatening to do so, announce that candidacy before the midterms, which would be a disaster, many Republicans say, because it would certainly change the political conversation. But his adherence to the big lie showing no signs of abating.
And Aisha, Jonathan's talking about the developments on the January 6th front. We saw and played for people that we got that information that former President Trump didn't want to say that the people who broke into the Capitol weren't part of his movement. What do you make of these new developments when you think about the fact that the president that we covered together continues to lie?
Well, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, like, this is what Trump does. Like, he's not going to let go of 2020. This idea of moving on and looking at the future, it's just not what Trump does. Trump never let go of 2016, and he won in 2016. So he's not going to let go of 2020 when he lost. And so that's what you're seeing. And I think, you know, with Pence having this, kind of trying to show that he's a little bit separate by saying, look, we should look to the future. But the problem is these little slight kind of head nods to like, well, maybe we should pull a little bit to a different direction. That's not going to work with Trump. He doesn't do subtlety. And he's like, you're either with him or you're against him. And right now, much of the Republican Party is with him.
And Aisha, you talk about him like someone who covered him for years, who knows exactly what happens in his head. I also want to talk to you because here it is. The DOJ is investigating former President Trump's actions as part of a criminal probe into efforts related to overturning the 2020 election. As you see this information, what comes to mind when you think about what the DOJ's work is at this point and what we know about their investigation?
Well, I think the fact that they are saying this, that this reporting is coming out, is important, especially for those Democrats and others who are frustrated because they feel like these January 6th hearings are going on. In their mind, they're hearing that this was the former president committed acts that they believe could be illegal, that he should not be treated as if he is above the law, and that they want to know what's being done about it. Like people who are not fans of former President Trump want to know what is going to be done. Is all this information going to come out and then nothing's going to happen? So I think it's important that that you hear that there's going to be an investigation. But the thing is, we don't know where that investigation will lead. And there have been a lot of investigations about Trump, and as we both know, and they haven't really, amounted to much. Like he has been able to come out, on the other side of all of them so far. And so we have to, be clear with viewers that we don't know what's going to happen with this investigation from the DOJ.
We certainly don't know what's going to happen. And John, as we think about this investigation, there's just another mystery after mystery opening up. This time, it's the Department of Homeland Security that's lost some text messages. I want to say that Representative Jamie Raskin said, I don't just know why everyone's texts and emails are suddenly disappearing all at once. I assume it's not a technological problem. So that's the congressman saying might be nefarious. What are you hearing? What do you think?
I was talking to Raskin about this. I mean, the January 6th committee, they're convinced privately, they'll cautiously, they'll say in public that the cover-up is, it's being whispered about. Because you have DHS on top of the Secret Service. I mean, that's not a coincidence. As far as they're concerned. I think they're going to keep pushing on this hard. And the other part is, this didn't come out until we had the Cassidy Hutchinson testimony. And that's when the Secret Service, there were officials in the Secret Service pushing back on that. But then this issue of the deleted text message and everything, they came out as a result of that. Hutchinson's veracity was challenged. Her Trump attacked her, or the Republicans attacked her, and now we have what appears to be a really troubling incident. And the IGs at both DHS and
The Secret Service.
Yeah, they knew about this for months.
It's incredible to think about it. And Jonathan, I want to come to you. We have about a minute left here. You have written this book. You understand the origins of the lies of the Trump election and what he's been talking about. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what you've learned in reporting that book, especially as we've seen Trump world starting to go into the grand jury with the DOJ and starting to cooperate even more with the January 6th committee.
Yeah, Trump, throughout his presidency, had a remarkable ability to bend others to his will. He really hijacked the Republican Party and conservative media to help amplify his lies, big or small, and certainly the biggest one of all about this election. And we're seeing here how people in the government would be willing to shatter norms, break regulations in order to help him hang on to power, that he had abused the power of the presidency to try to stay in office, and those around him were willing to help. And now it seems like, as John said, real talk of a cover-up here to try to hide what they did. So the impact and the resonance of the big lie continues and will through this election and next. It's going to be a defining issue, whether Trump is on the ballot or not.
And Aisha, 10 seconds. Trump also talked about just transphobic language, and it animated the group. It's the culture wars. We only have a couple seconds left. Just tell me a little bit about your thoughts there as we end this conversation.
Well, a lot of people are seeing this fight against the LGBTQ community as a way to other and make people seem like the other, and a way to rally their base against a changing society. And you see people like Donald Trump using that message of really hate and to go against the LGBT community.
An important point. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to our panelists for joining us and for sharing your reporting.